So today I want to give an overview of a very large subject. I'm going to try to talk for about half an hour on a pretty broad subject, water supply reliability estimation. In the Delta, we're supposed to be managing for co-equal goals of ecosystem health and water supply reliability. We spend probably more than 90% of our discussions in our science on the ecosystem health part, but I want to try to condense a little bit of an overview on water supply reliability so that we all have sort of a common starting place, even if that starting place is a place where people point to what I say and say, that's wrong, here's how we should make it better. So I'm going to try to condense this very large subject into a short period of time, and hopefully this provides an inoculation for you to, orientation for you to get started in thinking about this field, or maybe it's going to be so bad that you just run away from the room screaming and you content yourself with only one side of the co-equal goals. So here's where we were, and now the beginning is near, and now we can move ahead. So as an outline for what I want to talk about, I want to spend a little bit of time about water supply portfolios. We often talk about water supply reliability as if there's just one source of water and we only need to estimate the reliability of that one source. That's not how California works. That's how relatively few large water systems in California work. Usually we have a mix of supplies and a mix of water demand management activities that we bring together as a portfolio. So it's important, I think, to look at both supplies and demands together as a portfolio. We also are managing water for not just for one demand, but usually for a whole group of demands, different urban, and agricultural, and environmental demands. I want to talk a little bit about sources of unreliability. We often think about droughts, climate change as reasons why a water system wouldn't be reliable, but there's a whole bunch of other things that cause systems to become unreliable. Probably the biggest source of unreliability that we've seen historically is floods. So floods can be the biggest way to lose water supplies because they flood out your drinking water treatment plant, and then you have to spend months until that's repaired, and you're completely outed for that period of time. But there's a number of others. I'll talk a fair bit about estimating reliability in terms of simulation models and a couple of different approaches for using simulation models to estimate the reliability of water systems. As you'll see quoted later on, all of these models are wrong, but they're still better than our intuitions. So it forces us to think about things a bit more precisely. Here we're often all about performance measures. I know many of you here have suffered with the idea of performance measures, and as well we should. There's quite a few different metrics of reliability, some of which are useful and some of which are useless for different purposes. And then I'll try to summarize things together with some lessons at the end. So I always like this cartoon, and I try to look at every opportunity I can to spring it on people. Some of you have seen it in different talks of mine. How do we get water into our homes? For most public, many of us, and most politicians, this is their understanding of water systems. And in fact, I would say this is a positive thing. If you go to parts of the world that have very unreliable water systems, you know exactly what's in that box because you have to deal with it every day. So this is actually a sign. Our ignorance is in fact a positive sign that we have other things to think about. Complexity of water in California. This is not going to be new to a lot of you here. We have a very interesting geography of water in California in terms of its availability. The map on the left is the water availability, the runoff available in different parts of California. You notice that the runoff is in the locations where the people and the agricultural demands ain't. And you also know that California has a Mediterranean climate. We tend to have that water available in the wintertime. We tend to want a lot of water in the summer. So it's available when and where the people and the water demands ain't. To manage this mismatch seasonally and geographically, we've built a tremendous system of water infrastructure, water storage and reservoirs and groundwater, tremendous aquifers management, doing more of that with SGMA, tremendous conveyance infrastructure, as well as the reoperation of rivers. The other thing you'll notice about that map to the right, and it's all very colorful because we have on the order of 3,000 or 4,000 different water agencies that manage water. Most of them are local, but we have certainly quite a few state and federal agencies as well as regional agencies that have to get along in order for this system to work. This shows the water variability in California over time. So this is the some of you will know this is the precipitation in the Sacramento Valley for over the water year, accumulating from October 1st. And this shows the tremendous variability we have both seasonally and between years. Just to give you a sense for how variable water is in California, this shows the annual rainfall variability, precipitation variability in all these precipitation stations across California. For those of you that have had some statistics, this is the annual coefficient of variation for these precipitation gauges. What do you notice about California? It's weird. Okay, you all, anybody who's not from California knew this already, but y'all here are weird. I'm from Delaware, way over on the East Coast, and we have more flood years and drought years per average year than any other part of the country. Okay, that's how variable we are, and with climate change, it's going to become more so. So the good news is, the bad news is it's going to get worse. The good news is we're actually among the best at managing variability of any state in the country. This shows Oroville spillway in better days before it busted, but this also shows the unimpaired outflow from the Delta between years, between the wettest year of record at the time, 83, and the driest year, 77, as well as the average year. So you can see the tremendous seasonal and interannual variability we have for runoff, as well as precipitation. So water systems, we're going to look at water supply reliability. Water systems have lots of components. So here's a really simple one. We've got a surface water flow coming in, a river flowing into a reservoir. We've got a groundwater basin that provides supplies as well. We can sometimes move water from the surface water into the groundwater. We can pump from the groundwater to supply urban and farms. And sometimes we import and export water from the system. And then we also have fish. This is pretty simplified, and this is probably the best way to think about it initially. But really, for our purposes of water supply reliability for the state of California, for most of the water users, we've got something a lot more like this, where we have a lot of interacting, interconnected water users and water supplies over a huge state for different purposes, governed by different entities. It's a lot more fun than this, but we'll think mostly on this scale for today, but realize that the people that actually have to work on this, the people that we'll be hearing talk at the workshop next week, are mostly working at this scale a little bit more. Just to give you a little bit more detail on what a water system works, this is Orange County. So Orange County Water Agency has supplies that come in from the Delta through Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and supplies from the Colorado River that come in the same way. They're worried about climate change. They have water transfers that go back and forth between all these different users and different contractors. They have some regional surface water reservoirs and groundwater banking that they do. They've got a variety of water demands, and they've got the retail demand. So lots of things going on, both on the supply side and the demand side. This is sort of a table of the portfolio that I talked about at the beginning. Most modern water systems operate with a portfolio of water supplies and water demand management. So we have lots of different ways that we can gather up water, lots of ways that we can move water around from where it is to where we'd like it to be, lots of ways of storing it, essentially making water move through time, if you will, and then ways of treating the water So it's poor quality water can be made a higher quality water for some uses. And then operational things that we can do to manage all that network of supplies and demands more efficiently. On the demand side, we have lots of ways of managing all the different kinds of water demands. And then because every water system has thousands, if not millions, of people involved in it, from the users to the managers of the other neighboring systems and the suppliers, we have to have a set of incentives so everybody gets along well, right? Agreements and pricing and markets, education, subsidies, all the things that we try to do to get people to work well together. San Diego's got a portfolio over time that has evolved quite a bit. This is just on their supply side. They used to be very dependent on Metropolitan Water District, and now they're trying to diversify over time as their population has grown quite a bit. And you can see the colors. It's much more colorful now than it used to be as they've tried to diversify their portfolio. These portfolios operate at the local level as well as statewide. So, and the Delta is sort of central to that statewide part of the portfolio. So when people are operating water supplies in and out of the Delta, they're often operating it so that it matches with the portfolios of water users all over the state. So I tend to think it's not very useful to look only at the water supply reliability of exports from the Delta. What you really want to look at is the delivery reliability or the supply reliability, the mixed supply reliability for the users all over the state and the consequences of those, that reliability or unreliability. Demands, water demands, we have many different types of water demands. On the urban side, we have landscaping, sanitation, drinking water, et cetera. We often call this drinking water supplies, but how much water do you drink compared to how much water you use for the rest of your household? Okay. Drinking water is really very small. And actually the biggest component of urban water use is outside landscaping. It's about half of statewide water use for urban users. Agriculture, we have a mix of uses there as well. Water demands for trees and vegetables and pasture all have different values, all have different timings, all have different abilities to be curtailed during a drought. And environmental water uses have a lot of variability in terms of timing and the water quality, the dilution, the habitat, and the ecosystem support services that come out of water deliveries for ecosystem purposes and environmental purposes. These demands all vary with time. Think about how your water use varies over the day with when you flush toilets and when you take showers and when you don't, when you water your lawn and when you don't. Certainly in agriculture, we have tremendous seasonal variability in water use as well. And over time, we have historical change in water use as populations grow, as water conservation technologies get implemented, as the commodity prices for different crops change and bring growth or decline of different kinds of crops and different acreages. Final line here is the uses and the shortages for all these different uses are not equally valued. Everybody feels that their use is very valuable, but if you look at it economically or in larger social senses, I don't think we could argue that all uses are equally valued. And a lot of our disputes are over, well, you're valuing it more than I do. So there's a little bit of room for subjectivity here, but certainly in economic terms, they're not all equally valuable. And that provides some ability to have water markets and things like that to decrease the cost of unreliability. Two views of water demands. Traditionally, we would look at point demands for water. So we'd say, well, here's the time of year. Here's how much water each of these uses is going to be demanding, is going to want in a deterministic way. This is how much we'll want for the environment. This is how much in January we want for agriculture. This is how much for urban, and how it varies seasonally. That's pretty useful, but it doesn't give a sense for the relative value. Another view of water demands is a little bit more economic view of water demands. If you ask an economist what water demand looks like, they'll give you something that looks a little bit more like this. So at any particular time in this diagram, they would say, well, if you give me a little bit of water, I value that at a very steep rate. But once I get plenty of water, a little bit more water doesn't really help me a lot more, or it might even be bad for me. You know, might even flush out eggs or overwater the crops. The second view of water demand, the economic view, is I think, very insightful because it gives you a sense for the consequences of shortages. It's sort of like a tree falls in the forest. If nobody's there to hear it, doesn't make a sound, right? If there's a water shortage but there's nobody there to suffer any damage, is it really a shortage? You can argue about that, but I think you'll get the sense. There's a quote that I like to use from my wonderful colleague, Richard Howitt. There's a shortage of sport cars. I don't have one, okay? We would all like to have more water, more money, more land, more sports cars, things like that, but there's a way that we have to look at trade-offs here. Another quote that often comes from economists, and I like it also, there is rarely a shortage of water, but often a shortage of cheap water. And that's often what we get to when we're in droughts. This is pretty well illustrated by the crops in California. So this is a plot of all the crops in California. We have about 8 million acres of irrigated land. And we've ordered these, this is by Josue Medellin, we've ordered these by the profitability and the jobs in each of the crops. So you'll see here that about half of the irrigated acres are responsible for about 80 to 85, 90% of all the jobs and all the crop revenue in California. As a drought manager, I love this because it means if you manage a shortage well, you have relatively little damage. Now, if you're one of the grain farmers, you will feel it, but that's hopefully something a well-managed society can help compensate for. We have the same kind of general shape of impact to shortage in the urban sector. During the last drought, in 2015, we shorted all the urban areas by about 25%. And we did not have 25% unemployment resulting from that, right? Because we just didn't irrigate the lawns as much. And we had almost no economic impact from that tremendous reduction in water use. Sources of unreliability. There's a lot of different ways water systems can fail. And if you go talk to people that operate retail level water systems, they can tell you about a lot of things that they worry about and they keep them up at night. The first one we typically look at as planners, as policy people, is the lack of inflow or droughts. We spend, I think, probably a disproportionate amount of time at the policy level looking at droughts. They are obviously important, but they're not the only way things can go wrong. Floods, as I mentioned before, is a very common way to have big shortages of water. When you have a flood come through, a hurricane that comes through with a storm surge or a major river flood that takes out drinking water systems, drinking water treatment plants can give you zero water supply for a period of months. Earthquakes, wildfires, we've seen some wildfire outages causing concerns in California recently. We have mechanical and operational failures, as is the case in Flint, Michigan, where it was really a social failure. We say mechanical and operational, but that really means somebody goofed up on the mechanics. Water demands. We had the case of Cape Town, South Africa, where the water demands had grown quite a bit, and they hadn't really built out to prepare for those kind of demands. Some would argue that that might be one of our problems here. We've had having growing environmental demands, but we haven't really adjusted the infrastructure to provide for that as well. Regulations. We have now environmental regulations, water quality regulations that sometimes will affect the reliability of water quantity deliveries. Unreliable rules or agreements. Water markets, water contracts are very common in our system in order to make all of these hundreds and thousands of institutions work well together in their supply and demand portfolios. Well, what if one of those agreements gets violated or there's a misunderstanding or some delivery that was expected didn't happen? Well, that's the source of your unreliability. It wasn't necessarily a drought. And then, of course, there are multiple failures. You might have heard of cascade failures, where one little failure causes another failure, and so on. So those things are pretty common. So when we talk about unreliability, I think we ought to look at the whole gamut, or at least think about it a little bit. Some of them are harder to model than others. Representing sources of unreliability. How do you represent all these sources of unreliability? Oh, gosh. Well, these systems are pretty complex. How good is our intuition for reliability of these systems? I would say not very good. Even people that are really experienced with these systems probably have pretty good intuitions, but they're not going to communicate so well by intuition, and they're certainly not going to be able to communicate with other stakeholders, regulators, and the like with intuition. So we're going to have to do some numbers on this. These numbers are going to be terrible. They're going to have errors in them, they're going to have problems, but they're still better than our intuition, still better than our rhetoric, more reliable than our rhetoric, or than our hopes. So typically we represent unreliability as events. Okay, what happens if this pump goes out? What happens if this dam fails? This outlet structure fails? Time series. What happens if the time series of inflows into the reservoir is less because of climate change or a drought, or really big because of a flood? And we might have probabilities on these events and on these different time series that help us work out the relative frequency of different kinds of failures and how they're going to work together in a system, in a portfolio of activities. And we're going to base these events, these time series, these probabilities, well, the first thing might be on historic experiences. What's the historic record of flows into this reservoir? How often does these kind of pumps tend to go out? How often does an operator make a really foolish mistake? We have some historic understanding of what these things are likely to be. We might also have scenarios of concern, sort of a worst case scenario, worst cases that we look at, or climate change cases, or we have some new technology that's not completely tested. What happens if it works well? What happens if it works poorly? And then we can make up synthetic cases any which way that we think is insightful. So when we look at reliability and unreliability, we have to make essentially cases that are based on some notion of what we think is going to happen based on historic experience or some other synthetic means. Mostly we're going to use time series and what's called Monte Carlo analysis. How many of you have heard of Monte Carlo analysis? How many of you feel, if I asked you what it was, feel you could give me an answer? Should I test that hypothesis? Okay, well, let me just give you, Monte Carlo analysis is a very neat thing. It came out of World War II in the Manhattan Project. And in our modeling here, Monte Carlo analysis basically it relates to gambling, where you're going to try things a bunch of times randomly. So you're going to draw from the random distributions of all those types of unreliability and all those types of water demands, and then you're going to see with simulations what's the relative frequency of failures after you've drawn from all those random distributions, and rerun the model hundreds or thousands of times. Okay. So we'll have a simple simulation model, or I'll have a complex simulation model. Anyway, we'll have a simulation model that represents the whole system. Let me correct that. A simulation model never represents the whole system. It will represent a simplification of the system. And it will have all the major components that you have in your schematic, in your system that you want to represent. It'll have inputs of the capacities of all the bits of infrastructure, the inflows, the water available, the water demands, the operating rules, including the regulations, but how you're operating the reservoirs, how you're operating for the stream flows and the like. And as output, you're interested in particularly the deliveries, the water storages, and the water losses, and the economic losses from any shortages you might have. And the way these things work is really pretty simple. Inside the simulation is something we call conservation of mass. Everybody's familiar with this concept? Inflow minus outflow is change in storage. We could do conservation of people in this room, right? People coming in, people going out, number of people in the room. This room is storing people. Okay. And their rules and capacities. We can only accommodate so many people in this room. These doors will only allow us to leave at a certain rate. All kinds of rules that govern this. And so these simulation models are pretty universal in they will take a time series of these inflows and demands and how the operating rules and capacities, and they'll start at a present time, an initial time period with some initial storage, and then for each time step, they'll go to the next time step and say, okay, here's how much storage I have, here's the inflows, here are the demands, I'm going to consult the operating rules and the capacities, and I'll say, this is how much water I'm going to deliver, this is how much water I'm going to keep in storage, then I go to the next time step, and I do it all over again. So it's really pretty methodical. These models are really complex in some sense, but in some sense they're very simple. They're just time stepping through the whole period of the simulation to see, okay, well, what do the rules say about how we're supposed to operate this within the physical constraints and the institutional constraints on the system. All these simulation models are essentially what-if models. What do we think would happen if we had these capacities, we had these rules, we had these regulations, we had these demands? They really represent legions of details and simplify legions of details. When you think about all the valves, all the people, all the pipes, all the users in a water demand system, all of which are behaving a little bit erratically, we're trying to simplify that down so it has some aggregate representation of what's likely to happen. We run these simulations for each case, each of the different inflow scenarios, each of the different demand scenarios, each of the different reliability scenarios that we have to estimate the consequence, the responses and the consequences of that operation. And then we'll take the results for each case, assign probabilities to each of those cases and their outputs to assess the overall reliability and the overall consequences from that simulation. So here's an example. This is an example for this is actually from the State Water Project Water Supply Delivery Reliability Report in 2015. And these are run for some particular level of development. So they're going to say by this year or by 2030, we're going to expect this much water demands, and these will be the rules of the game, the operating rules and the regulatory rules. And we're going to take the historic record, and we're going to run the model for that historic record for that future level of development, and we're going to get a time series of model results. Okay, so there are two lines here, one with BDCP and one for existing conditions as of that time. And you'll see it goes up and down, and you'll go, wow, isn't that pretty, huh? And then we have to go from that to reliability. So we have to have some probabilities here. And we're going to take all the deliveries here. In this case, these are diversions from the delta. And we're going to sort them from the highest to lowest. And the highest has a low probability, and the lowest has a low probability. And we're going to have the cumulative probability. So the lowest one has a high probability of being exceeded. Right? It was exceeded in 100%, almost 100% of all the years. And then we'll plot these up from the lowest to highest with their probabilities. And we can see from this then that the probability of having less than 5 million acre-feet of exports is about, what, about 65% for current conditions. Okay. Is this making some sense? Okay. Corey's nodding because he took my class. He already passed. You can say you're confused now. It doesn't matter. The grades have been turned in. Well, when I did this for the 2015 Water Supply Reliability Report, and put it in one of the papers I referenced, I also plotted up what happened in 2014 and 2015 and what those recurrent frequencies would be. And you'll notice that they turned out to be lower. Okay. This is not bad. This is just an indication that when people give you these curves, they're probably wrong. I mean, they're not totally wrong, they're still insightful. They'll still give you some ideas of what's going on and how reliable things are. But it's not unusual in one of the worst droughts of record to see results that are worse than what you predicted. And you've got to be prepared for that if you're a responsible person running a water system. You've got to be prepared for all kinds of things going wrong. Another way to look at reliabilities in a more seasonal operation context. So there's a couple of different contexts that we use reliability, really many. I'll talk about two. One is the sort of predictive of long-term planning. That was the previous example. In a particular operating season, we know where this water storage is now. But much like today, here we are in the winter, and we don't know how wet the winter is going to be and how much snowpack there's going to be. So we could start off with today's storage in the simulation model, and then run the simulation model with forecast demands and the many future possible inflows. In the case of this example up here, which was from the Columbia River system, we ran it for, I think, 65 historical years. So they have 65 years of unimpaired inflow. You run it through the model, and this is what happened with storage in Grand Coulee. It tells you, well, for the next couple of months, I think that reservoir is going to be pretty high. And there's almost 100% probability that it's going to refill by June. Those are good things to know. How low could it be? If I've got a boat ramp here, what's the probability that boat ramp's going to go dry? I can now estimate it in some crude sense by this kind of approach. And so you could also estimate, this is from the original approach that used this so-called plotting position approach, Hirsch 1978. You could plot up a cumulative distribution of what's the probability distribution of storage in this reservoir, or of demand, whatever you like. But this tends to be used for reliability in the coming year. So if you are the state water board and you're interested in what's the likelihood of reclamation running out of water for winter run salmon before the end of this year, you might be doing this kind of analysis. Some overall thoughts on estimating system reliability. All models are wrong, but some are useful. My favorite quote from George Box. We get those delivery reliability results from models and model results. But as we saw before, we really have to think about these results. Someone just gives you a pile of numbers, it's just a pile of numbers. You're not really interested in a pile of numbers. You're interested in what's the reliability on some of that? Reliability of the reliability estimates, if you will. You want some thinking, insightful thoughts on this. So there's my favorite quote again, and my second favorite quote: the purpose of computing is insight, not numbers. So if you hire a consultant or a university person, they give you a pile of numbers, you want the insights. What does this mean for my operations? You want that person to learn enough about your operations so that they can tell you what this means for what you should or shouldn't be doing to prepare for different contingencies. These models have different components to them. People often ask, well, what's the right model? What's the best model? Well, I don't really know, because a model has several components. It has the software component that includes the mathematical formulation, the calibration of all the little parameters, constants in the model, and whatever version it was, because if you're really using a model, you're always changing it. And if you have a bunch of different people using the same model, I'll bet they're all developing different versions, because there's so much of the modeler involved in that. So you have these experts that are using different data, they're updating the data, they're operating the operating rules, they're modifying the model, the calibration, and the modeler is really the person behind the model, is really orchestrating all of this and hopefully interpreting it to give you some insights, to pull the insights out of it. The model is really just an analytical form of reasoning to give you some insights, not necessarily just numbers. hopefully much more than numbers. So the interpretation and the documentation of these models is really fundamental. It's not unusual at all to see two very, very good modelers come out with fairly different, plus or minus 10 or 20% differences in water supply reliability in some cases. I want to run through just a few examples. This was the water supply reliability report, water delivery capabilities report, they call it, from the State Water Project. Here DWR does this every 2 years, and they estimate for each of their individual contractors with the historical hydrology and present conditions in terms of regulations and such, what's the probability distribution of deliveries you're likely to get on an annual basis for every water contractor. Orange County has a really nice report that I have a reference to at the back. Has a much more complex local and regional system. As you saw in the earlier schematic, they have a lot of different supplies. They have some abilities to manage demand and groundwater. And this particular report is very interested in climate change and in water fix, because they get a lot of their water directly or indirectly for the Delta. And they have these nice exceedance probability plots of their water deliveries from the different sources, and then the probability distributions of shortages that they might get under different conditions with and without water fix, and different kinds of climate change or other investments. Metropolitan Water District does a lot of integrated modeling this way. Their system is even more complex because they're a wholesaler, and then they have to represent their retailers and how much water demands they're going to have and how they're going to respond over time. So they have a very integrative system modeling and have a very different way of representing, as hopefully we'll see next week, the probabilistic aspect of inflows and droughts. So their demands are really important, and so here's one of their probability distribution reports that comes out of their integrated regional modeling. They really like to keep 1 million acre-foot of storage, and so they get really nervous if they have less than 1 million acre-foot of water in storage, and so they're always interested in what's the probability we're going to have less than 1 million acre-foot of storage, so that they'll know how well they're going to sleep at night. I should really color this diagram a little bit more, but I want to come back to this delivery reliability example plot and interpret it a little bit more for you. So let's say this is the delivery reliability for an agricultural water system, and we would like to have this amount of water delivered, maybe 700,000 acre-feet per year as a delivery target. Well, we're okay in these years, 40% of the years when we have that much or more. When we've got more than that available, what can we do with it? Gosh, we've got extra water some of these years. That's an opportunity. Can you bank it? Can you recharge it to an aquifer? Can you sell it or exchange it to somebody else so that you can get some of that water back? When you have less than the target being delivered by your surface water system, now you have to struggle. Well, maybe I can pump more groundwater to make up that difference. And so you might say that for each of these different events, this is the amount of water that you could pump from groundwater to make up that difference. And that be part of your portfolio. You might maintain some annual crops that you can fallow. You don't want to, because you really don't want to fallow your almonds. That's very expensive. So you might fallow some annual crops with some probability and some amount. And you might be purchasing water from outside to keep your trees going for some fraction of the years. So when you look at these reliability curves in the context of your whole portfolio, you can say, well, what's the relative frequency that I'm going to have surface water deliveries as well as all of the different major elements of your portfolio being activated? And what's that going to cost you? Okay, because you have costs for each of these things as well. Does that make some sense? For an urban area, you might have some different levels of water conservation that you're implementing. groundwater pumping, water contracts that you're activating with agricultural users to buy water, and then more draconian types of water rationing that you'll do under very big shortages. Metrics of reliability. There's a lot of different metrics for reliability. The oldest one, and probably the one still used most, is something called the firm yield. How many of you have heard of the firm yield? Okay. So the firm yield is the amount of water that a reservoir system could theoretically deliver with 100% reliability with the historical unimpaired inflow record. Okay, so if things weren't changing in terms of hydrology, that firm yield, in theory, you can rely on it. Well, it's not really that way entirely, because if you have a short record, it's easy to have a high firm yield. The longer your record, the more likely it is you're going to have a worse drought. So the firm yield is never completely firm. So starting in 1914, Hazen and some others started to develop ideas for reliabilities of achieving target deliveries. And that's becoming more commonly used. We have all these words that we develop, robustness, resiliency. You've probably seen words like these recently. How many of you know exactly what they mean? If you're going to quantify those things. So these often have some really nice concepts behind them, but they often tend to obscure the discussion. Expected annual damage, that's something we've developed and used quite a lot in flood damages and flood management, but I think it also has some value in water supply unreliability. And then probability distributions of performance in all kinds of different ways. So there's lots of ways to quantify reliability, but that doesn't make it less confusing. Sometimes it can make it more confusing. Climate change and reliability. We're going to have more variability, both seasonally and interannually, in hydrology and surface water supplies. It's going to make groundwater components much more important. This is just a plot of export reliability from DWR report for quite a few different conditions. Most of them getting worse, or getting more variable at least, even where they have the same average. People talk about non-stationarity and climate change as if climate change is the only form of non-stationarity that our systems have. California has always been a non-stationary system. We've always had non-stationarity in water demands, the economic structure of the values that we're using water for, non-stationarity in terms of the species that are coming in, lots of different forms of non-stationarity, and we're part of it here in terms of the rules and regulations that add to the non-stationarity of the system. As water managers and people interested in total system reliability, we're actually kind of interested in all of these. So I'm getting towards the end, fortunately. Some issues and lessons. Reliability estimates really are an integration of the knowledge that we have of the system, the demands, the supplies, and the operations. Where there's really synthetic activity, and so I think it has a lot of value because it forces us to think in detail about how all these things come together and which ones are important and which ones are less important. The reliability of the components, I think, is less important than the reliability of the system, which is the main reason we have these portfolios, because they give us a more robust system, a more reliable system. We look at the reliability of the delta versus the reliability of the ability of providing water at the user level. Portfolio reliability and the management are the really key. How do you respond to shortages, and what portfolio of options do you have for managing those different conditions? Model results and these estimates of unreliability and reliability are all going to be insightful, and they're all going to have some errors, so you shouldn't take them as gospel. Tremendous importance for the insights and the interpretation, because that's really what you're interested in. You're not really interested in the numbers. You're interested in the insights as to what you should do for management or regulation. Non-stationarity has many forms, and you should all demand interpreted delivery reliability plots. So since I'm a professor, I'll give you some suggested readings, and I'll stop there. Thank you for your patience. So it was longer than half an hour. I apologize. Any questions? Is that clear? Is that useful? Or was it so unclear that you're just going, huh? I tried to keep the math out of it.
Does this work? Yeah. We're going to try these little pod things. Don't bring them too close to your mouth.
Your ecosystem demand management, could you give us some examples of what that looks like?
Well, at the extreme end, you capture as many of the ones in the wild and you stick them in a hatchery, right? I mean, another better example, I think, out of the drought was what we did for waterfowl. So there was an organization, TNC, you might have heard of it. They were involved with several other land managers and refuge managers during the drought, and they saw the birds coming and they said, well, we think we need this many acres of this type of habitat on these locations. Let's go negotiate with different farmers and talk to each other to coordinate the management of supplying those sort of water supply-based resources for the birds as they came through. So there's quite a lot of things. I think demand management on the ecosystem side has been relatively unexplored, unformalized, but I think it's certainly there. Other questions?
So you talked about a lot of kind of different ways to define reliability or calculate reliability or go about this. Is the idea to kind of more standardize this? Because it seems to me that you've got all these local retail water at the farthest end of the pipe. You've got these retail water agencies with their supply portfolio that might include groundwater and all these other things, and maybe they've got some surface water that they're getting from a wholesaler. They really have very limited ability to calculate reliability of that wholesale supply, so they're dependent on a wholesaler who has to provide them a reliability report, and then they have to ingest that information and figure out how that is applied. So I guess if you could talk a little bit more about how this all comes together, what the...
So put yourself, I mean, all water management is local in a sense, just like politics in a way. So put yourself in the situation of being a manager for some local water district, irrigation district or urban districts, and you're getting imported water from the Delta. You've got some groundwater, maybe you have your own local surface water. You've got a mix of water demands that you can maybe short or not short with different costs or different political consequences. So you're always thinking about water supply reliability, and lots of different ways things can go wrong. And when the wholesalers say, well, we've done this report that has these estimates of our single source reliability, you're looking at it and going, yeah, thank you. What do I do if that's wrong? What do I do if it drops off the bottom?
Well, it doesn't even have to be wrong, right? You can just be at the low end of that thing and get your really low delivery.
There's two ways it can be wrong. One is you can drop off the bottom, as we did here, or you can just have the frequency wrong. But there's lots of different ways to go wrong in reliability, as you all probably know from your own personal life, right? Driving cars and leaks in your roof, all kinds of things. They're all subject to the same kind of vagaries. But it helps to do the analysis anyway. I mean, just because we don't know exactly what our future incomes and future expenses will be doesn't mean we don't do retirement calculations when you get to be my age.
Oh God, what have I done? Yes, I have a question about maybe I'll just hold it away and speak loud.
I don't know how to turn it on.
Go ahead.
Okay. I guess I have a question about the implicit, like, holy cow of water supply reliability, which is water rights reliability, and how much of...
Sure. Well, those are just the rules. So the water rights are just the rules of who gets water first, and when are you shorted. So that when we talk about operating rules for the system, the water rights are part of that set of rules.
Yeah, and so I guess my question was that the water rights are a gap between the economic model that you showed of marginal benefit, and how do you think is a part of reliability, or when we talk about it, closing the gap between the way our rights allocate water and our... That's
a good point. So if your rule set includes water rights, but not allow you to trade between users, then you'll get a different kind of set of losses that occur to different people than if you have a water rights set and you have an ability to trade water between users. So that's just part of the rules to me.
Is it on? Can you hear me? Yeah.
I can hear.
Okay. Jay, how would you take into account water markets in the sense of, wholesalers deal with water trading and exchanging and so forth, but yet ratepayers are kind of locked in. It's heavily regulated.
Right.
How does that influence the reliability of water?
Quite a bit. So if you are, let's take a simple case, say during a drought, you have an agricultural area that has very senior water rights, and they're growing something not that's valuable. Maybe it's rice, but it's something they can fallow. We have quite a few examples of this in the last few decades. And then you have an urban area, or maybe you have an almond farmer that has something where the economic damages of shorting them, even if there were more junior water rights, are pretty high. Well, they might want to go and talk to the agricultural water user that's growing rice and say, how about if I buy some water from you? And so you can increase the unreliability to the farmer, but he's happier because you paid him, the rice farmer. Whereas the almond farmer and the city is, they're happy to have paid someone else. They would rather have had full deliveries, of course, but they'd rather pay the farmer than have suffered the shortage. And in the modeling, we can represent that quite often. One of the kinds of modeling that I do is optimization modeling, which has a lot of that going on.
Would you model it as another overlay on top of the system, or is it an actual component in the system?
There's two ways to do it. One is to model the separate components with abilities to buy and sell water at the fringes of your schematic. My favorite way to do it is to make one big schematic for the whole state, and let's just model as one big market. In actuality, you probably ought to do both. Because that gives you a sense for what kind of deals do you really need to cut, and how far in advance should you be doing it in order to coordinate the operations of all these different groups. Other questions?
We have the room till 7 p.m., so. Last chance.
I guess in the context of the delta, that's what we all focus on here. How would you think about, obviously DWR produces their delivery reliability report every 2 years, and they have a methodology that they've used for quite a while, which is probably not perfect. No, none is, but it is what it is. Do you have any thoughts about how delivery reliability of export supplies out of the delta might be provided in a more helpful or more productive way?
I think that could be a really interesting outcome of this review. I'm going to be politic about it, saying it that way. There's a lot of other state policies that are very important for this. We have the environmental flows. We have water fix just in the Delta, those things. But even outside of the Delta, we have the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act implementation. So I would imagine that all those farmers in the San Joaquin and Tulare basins that are in overdraft, they're going to be looking to see how much more water, if any, they can get out of the Delta. And that's going to have a tremendous impact, I think, on the demand south of the Delta for water, both in terms of the quantity and the economic value of those deliveries. And that could easily drive some markets in terms of farmers in Kern County trying to buy water from the north. So it'll be an interesting problem. Always will be. Other questions? Okay. Well, we suffered enough. Thank you.